So, in reading the amended complaint from Blake Lively of her lawsuit against Justin Baldoni, there's some very interesting things. But before I get to that, I needed to make a timeline, because the reason I need to make a timeline is to have some sense of what happened here. And that can only be done with a timeline. I will say timelines are extremely clarifying in so many ways. Of course, this starts with the fact that these folks were working on a movie called It Ends With Us. The movie wrapped on February 9, 2024. After a little bit of drama right beforehand, an all-hands-on-deck meeting on January 4, in which Blake Lively had some complaints about various treatment involving what she defined, which she alleges as some sort of sexual inappropriateness. It's sort of unclear exactly what she's talking about. That is not revealed in the complaint in a way that I think is evidentiary. There's just sort of vague references. So in the summer of 2024, Justin Baldoni hires a PR crew to come in there and help with the possibility of that information coming out, which, as we know now, did come out. I'm sure his spidey senses went off, as they should have, because we live in a world where if that type of allegation becomes public, your career could end in 24 hours. And believe me, I've seen it happen. So, it particularly with regard to anything involving the New York Times and the New York Times' reporting. So there are some text messages in this that are very interesting, and particularly not, a few of which are not particularly good for the Baldoni team. But for the most part, they are explained in his lawsuit against the New York Times that was filed in early of 2025. But as we look at the timeline as it goes by here, there were, planning certainly around crisis communications, as you would think there would be in such a situation. I don't think anybody should be criticized for getting ready for one of these things. Again, we've seen several careers completely upended, including the governor of New York, Al Franken, you name it, all to find out later, and particularly in the case of Al Franken, that it was about a whole lot of nothing. And you got to remember that the media is going through a stage right now of having a very hard time getting attention. This is an attention economy, and these big media platforms, even the New York Times, I think, are very worried about the lack of attention that they get, and spectacle is the only way to get it. And when you're talking about celebrities, and particularly an A-list celebrity involved in this story, they're going to do that story. I was particularly fascinated on this timeline that in reading Mr. Baldoni's suit against the New York Times, that they gave him less than 24 hours to respond. Boy, does that sound familiar to me. In the case that I dealt with regarding the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Justin Fairfax, they gave him absolutely no time to respond. They wrote a piece without even contacting us. Literally, the New York Times spoke to two attorneys, Deborah Katz and Nancy Erica Smith, and put a rape story in the paper with no evidence attached to it, and published that and destroyed somebody's life. I mean, that's what they do. They know they can get away with it, particularly with elected officials and public figures. And so they continue to do it. And that is why I predict that Time Sullivan is going to get flipped. They're eager to publish these stories. These stories get a lot of traffic, a lot of attention. As you can see, this story is getting a ton of attention online and every place else. So what is the incentive to get it right? Well, there really isn't any incentive to be accurate. What I find is whether these stories are true or false, they still win. They still get the traffic. They still get the web traffic, the subs that come with that, and everything else. I'm not surprised when I read some of the things in Baldoni's lawsuit against the New York Times, and I cannot wait to do a video on the specific lawsuit, because there are so many things in here that are extremely familiar. But the whole hours where he gets called, actually what happens is they get called on the night of December 20 at 9 o'clock. Now, picture this in your mind. You get called by the New York Times, Megan Twohey, who's one of the mothers of Me Too journalism, because she did the Weinstein reporting. And they call you at 9:30 at night, 9:20 at night, and you have to respond by the next day to a story that will be published to millions the next day. One of the really unfair things about that is that you don't have any time to get any documents together. You don't have any time to get your proof together that story might be completely inaccurate. So that is just crazy. But that's the New York Times does this all the time, and it comes up all the time, and it comes up all the time across the board. I typically deal with political stories, but they do this all the time because they can. There's nothing stopping them, and this is the reason why I predict that Time Sullivan is going to get flipped, because people can sense that something is going on that's not quite fair. But to have a cause of action against the New York Times is completely a waste of time, because nobody can win a lawsuit against the New York Times. Nonetheless, I will be analyzing this anyway. But it is pretty valiant, actually, that Justin Baldoni is suing them, because I'm sure his attorneys told him, you're not going to win this. You're not going to win this libel suit. But they've got a problem at the New York Times, because so much of what they based the story on were text messages that apparently were incomplete. And Blake Lively's filing late last night of the amended complaint has some footnote in there making an excuse as to why they were incomplete. And I'm going to get to that very soon, because that is a consequential problem, you know. And one of the things that you can see right off the bat is a lack of hard evidence on her side in the form of text messaging and emails. And I get that the New York Times might have thought that, well, we've got a lawsuit coming up and a case coming up, so we can, you know, she's going to file a lawsuit, so that'll shield us from defamation. We can write about the lawsuit and everything is great. Their problem is they didn't give Baldoni enough time to tell them what the other side of the situation was. There's no way that he had enough time to respond. I mean, it's just craziness. Now, I've seen it a million times. You call him on, oh, let's call him at 9:30 at night. I had a client that was dealing with the New York Times where the email came in at 2:30 in the morning, 2:30 a.m. for a story that was going to get published less than 24 hours later. I mean, it is crazy. People have no idea what these media organizations do, and I think there's an assumption, oh, it's the New York Times, so they couldn't possibly be doing that. Oh, believe me, they're doing it, and they know they can get away with it. This is Lauren Burke. I've worked in the media and in politics. And I'll be back very soon, because Baldoni's lawsuit is bringing back some flashbacks for me on several clients. I'll be back soon.